Last time we spoke about the bloody siege of Port Arthur. General Nogi Marisuke lost a lot during the Russo-Japanese War. At Port Arthur, it would cost him thousands of young men, his last son, and in many ways his soul. The 3rd IGA fought tooth and nail to take each feature one by one, inching ever closer to the port city. Nogi's initial strategy was to target the east, and it was a terrible failure, costing countless men and nearly his command. When prodded by Baron Kodama to target 203-meter hill, Nogi's men had finally found the crux to Port Arthur's defenses. It was a terrible and bloody ordeal, but once 203-meter hill fell, the 3rd IGA were finally able to deploy their artillery in a position to smash the trapped Russian fleet. Now Port Arthur was back in Japanese hands, and all that remained was Mukden. This episode is the Russo-Japanese War Part 8, a stalemate at Shaho and Sandepu. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over there I've just released an episode investigating the story of Yang Kyung-jung, the supposed Korean man who fought for the Imperial Japanese Army, the Red Army, and the Wehrmacht during World War II. But is his story real? Come find out. Also, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel for more exclusive podcasts. Port Arthur had finally fallen, and the forces of Kuropatkin were once again on the retreat. Kuropatkin sought to establish defenses at Taeling, as the area was more suitable to make a stand rather than the plains surrounding Mukden. Yet, as had become customary, Alexiev intervened, stressing, quote, "The continued retreat to Taeling will not prove favorable to the morale of the army." The Russian forces were completely demoralized, and the Honghuzi became very emboldened. The Chinese bandits struck at the fleeing Russian forces, particularly the Cossacks. Japanese officers were directing their efforts, trying to hit train carts full of supplies. Russian soldiers and officers were suffering from dysentery and venereal diseases. Many also fell to the bottle. And finally, Kuropatkin's numerical advantage would seem to be lost, as General Nogi's 3rd IGA would soon be coming to join up with the rest. Tsar Nicholas II decided to form a second Manchurian army under the command of General Oskar Kazimirovich Gripenberg. The man was more politician than soldier, however. He had not seen active service since the Crimean War, and even then he had only commanded a battalion. At the ripe age of 66, he was also deaf, and quite the hypochondriac. He came to Manchuria and brought with him news of the motherland. St. Petersburg was seeing more dissonance. The people were in rapid disorder. The overall feeling was that of revolution. Now for the Japanese side, they were also licking their wounds. They had lost many men, and to remedy the loss of manpower, they created a new ordinance on September the 29th, raising an additional 46,548 men to replace over 1/6 of their army that had fallen. Marshal Oyama looked to his logistics, preparing for the next engagement, and probably did not expect what Kuropatkin did. Kuropatkin suddenly went on the offensive. He sent out these orders. "I order the Manchurian army, entrusted to my command, to attack the enemy in whatever position he may be occupying, having as the main object to gain possession of the right bank of the Tatsu River." Kuropatkin scheduled an attack to be made on October the 5th, shaking the Russian army out of their depression to see if they could exact vengeance. Gripenberg and his command had not yet arrived to the theater of war when Kuropatkin began his offensive plans. Gripenberg's army consisted of the 6th and 8th Siberian Corps, the 61st Infantry Division, and a division of Don Cossacks. In the meantime, Alexiev gave Kuropatkin the 6 Siberians. Despite the losses inquired upon his forces, at this time Kuropatkin still held superiority in numbers, with 261 battalions versus Oyama's 170. At Mukden, Kuropatkin had formed a bridgehead. To his south was the Taitsu River, to the east ran the Shaho. The railway line ran parallel to the old Mandarin Road. Around the Shaho area were hills, and west of it, many villages. The terrain east of the Mandarin Road was mountainous, forcing infantry to be confined to very narrow pathways. Kuropatkin divided his forces into two, forming a western and eastern army. Behind this were the general reserves, 2 flanks of guards, and a rear guard. The western force consisted of the 10th and 17th Corps, with 4 regiments of Cossacks led by General Bildering. The eastern force consisted of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Siberian Corps, with a division of Cossacks under the command of Stakelberg. He ordered his army to advance along a 20-mile front through the Pianyao-Lupu to Penshuhu. Within his reserves were the 4th Siberians and the 1st European Corps. The 6th Siberians made up the rear guard. The bulk of Kuropatkin's front-line force was east of the railway, but the west held more favorable ground for artillery and cavalry. The terrain to the east was less favorable for movement, yet Kuropatkin chose here to make his main thrust. Perhaps Kuropatkin planned to surprise the Japanese with such a bold move, yet it would not work. Oyama's forces had just been reinforced by a cavalry brigade who were occupying a narrow position going from the coal mines at Yantai to Santaitsu. Oyama sought to concentrate his forces as much as possible in the hopes of an opportunity for an offensive to show itself. Oyama placed General Oku's 2nd IGA on the left, General Nozu's 4th IGA in the middle, and Kuroki's 1st IGA on the right. Within his reserve was the 12th Division, near the right flank's rear. Oyama's intelligence could not find 2 Russian corps locations, so he held back 3 Kobe brigades and a field artillery brigade in reserve at Liaoyang. 15 miles northeast in the mountains at Pianyao-Lupu was Umezawa's Kobe Brigade scouting forward. Umezawa's force were having a difficult time because of the faulty maps that they had. Kuropatkin was going to use his western force to launch a holding attack, seeing 2 corps face off against the 2nd and 4th IGA. The disparity in strength was roughly 45,000 versus 72,000. Meanwhile, the eastern force would perform the main assault with over 73 albeit understrength battalions, numbering 50,000 men or so. The 1st IJ would be roughly 40,000 strong. The first contact would be made in front of Umezawa's position. Kuroki was convinced the main Russian assault was about to hit the northeastern area, where Umezawa was, but Oyama was not convinced of this. Kuroki would turn out to be right. One of his patrols came across some documents on a dead Russian officer showcasing Stakelberg's offensive. When Oyama was presented with the evidence, he immediately ordered a preemptive attack against the perceived main Russian thrust. Umezawa pulled his brigade out of their position on the 7th of October, moving to Penshuhu. The Russians quickly seized Penshuhu by the 10th, securing their right flank as Umezawa was forced to pull back even further. Meanwhile, the 5th IJ Division's advance was being hampered by a Russian regiment, and the 2nd IJ were pushing the 17th Corps further back. The Russians formed a new central group consisting of the 4th Siberian Corps and a Cossack division led by Mishinka. This was done to plug up a gap created between the western and eastern forces. The eastern forces were being bogged down heavily due to the mountainous terrain. The communication line and maps were quite poor. Stakelberg was also being overly cautious in his movements, while Oyama was being quite simplistic in his orders. I desire to drive the enemy at present east of the Mukden Highway, towards the northeast. The result saw the entire force, excluding the 12th Division and Umezawa's men, advancing 16 miles to a new line from Fengqipu to Guanyin. The goal was to smash the Russian center with the 2nd, Guards, 10th, and 5th Division. The 4th IJ would wheel around the right, while the 2nd IJ would attract the attention of the Russians' right, drawing their reserves. On the morning of the 11th, the battle swayed back and forth in the mountains, and around the villages over the plains. The Russians were having the soldiers go shoulder to shoulder upon features, meeting the onslaught of attacks. Wherever it looked like the Japanese might break through, the Russian commanders screamed for reserves to be brought up. This caused a bit of confusion amongst so many reserve units being called forward. The Japanese used the night to gain momentum, sneaking around while the Russian artillery was less effective. On the night of the 11th, the 4th IJ were to perform their wheeling maneuver, seeing the 10th Division advance. At 1 a.m., the division surged forward with bayonets fixed. Each man was wearing a black greatcoat over his khaki uniform. The men were also wearing white armbands, as a previous attack had gone disastrously when neither side could figure out who was friend and who was foe. Apparently, a Japanese commander had given his men orders, "Japanese are short, foreigners are tall." And this did not go too well. The Russians had a fortified village and from its walls fired upon the incoming Japanese. The Japanese grabbed volunteers to breach the wall, seeing 200 men set off for a keshitai, known in English as a forlorn hope attack. Most of the group's leaders were shot or bayoneted, but their sheer weight won the night. In one of the village houses, the Japanese found a regimental commander. He was severely wounded and he could hardly stand, but he refused to surrender. The Japanese night attack was an attempt to form a wedge between the Western force and Central Group. It achieved its objective at the cost of 60 officers and 1,250 casualties. Most of these were from the 5th IJ Division, whose job was to wheel around the heart of the enemy's position. That night, Stackelberg ordered his men to attempt a breach of the Japanese lines. Their first effort was directed at the Tailing Pass, but they were easily swept aside as the Japanese had anticipated the attack. A second attempt was made and succeeded somewhat, but the Japanese were quick to counterattack. The Japanese seized the position back, and the Russians were calling up more and more reserves in response. The next day, Kuropatkin lost the initiative to Oyama. Oyama had succeeded in bringing superior numbers to a critical point. It was evident the 10th IJA Division had suffered tremendous casualties, so the 5th IJA Division was brought up. Now the Russian right wing, consisting of the 17th Corps, some 25,000 men, would be hit by 3 Japanese divisions, totaling 32,000 men. Until this point, Kuropatkin had not committed over 50,000 men and 250 guns in his reserve. The bulk of the 6th Siberian and 1st European Corps were untasked, and the 2nd Siberians were basically stuck in limbo, while Kuropatkin and Stackelberg kept up a series of long-distance messages unable to coordinate properly. Kuropatkin was patiently awaiting reports from Stackelberg's offensive in the east, hoping he would have a breakthrough. However, again, these terrible maps that everyone had about the rough mountainous terrain area were hampering all efforts of navigating them. It was not just the terrain. Stackelberg was not the same officer he was at the beginning of the war. Stackelberg was weary, he was quite demoralized. The 2nd Cavalry Brigade of Prince Kanin, reinforced with 1,200 men, began a southern advance against Stackelberg. The attack had the element of surprise, and it forced the cavalry divisions of Samsonov and Lubavin to pull out, exposing Rennenkampf's infantry along the northern bank of the river. This action would force Stackelberg to order a general retreat. In the west, the 17th Corps, reinforced with a brigade of the 6th Corps, were exposed to attacks from the 2nd IGA. The 6th Corps commander refused to assist. This left the 17th Corps to fight it alone, and they were severely defeated, and they were forced to withdraw along their entire front. The 219th Regiment, part of the 6th Corps, had just arrived to the scene and encountered the retreating men of the 139th and 140th Regiments. Yet the 219th Regiment kept advancing, unsupported by any artillery, towards a position that was occupied by over 6 Japanese battalions and 11 batteries. Such was the communications failure at Shaho for the Russians. The Japanese held their fire as the 219th advanced within just 600 yards. The first experience of battle for the 219th would be the combined fire of 66 guns and thousands of rifles. They were literally blasted to pieces. They quickly routed, leaving behind 22 officers and 832 men on the ground. A quarter of the regiment had literally been lost. The morning of the 13th saw the Eastern Group retreating. The same day saw the arrival of the 5th Kobe Brigade, allowing Oyama to reinforce his depleted 12th Division. Meanwhile, the Guards Division were in serious trouble as Stackelberg had tossed a counterattack at them. Luckily for the Guards, when they pulled back, So did the Russians, so they did not pursue them at all. Oyama tossed all of his remaining reserves to restore the equilibrium, and he hoped the added help would allow Kuroki's 1st IJ to cut off the retreating eastern force. The Russians were gradually forming a full retreat at this point. Bildering's western force found some breathing space as the 2nd IJ were nearing exhaustion. Oyama had no further reserves. The next reinforcements would be the 8th Division arriving by train to Liaoyang. The Russian right flank was still holding firm, with their uncommitted guard led by Lieutenant General Dembowski. Dembowski had a force of 16 squadrons and 32 guns that he tossed into the mix, and perhaps they could severely hurt the 4th IJ Division. Oyama then gave out new orders to pursue the enemy as far as the left bank of the Shaho River. On the 14th, the demoralized Russians were falling back through a very rainy night. Again, rain was saving the Russians' withdrawal. At 7:20 a.m., Shaopu was lost by the 10th Corps. The 10th Corps were still trying to hold a southern portion of the Shaho River, but they were gradually withdrawing. To try and stop them, Kuropakin sent 10 battalions with orders to smash southwards. That night, the 10th Corps withdrew, leaving only 3 points to the south of the river within Russian hands. These were the villages of Namunsun, One Tree Hill, and Putilov Hill. Meanwhile, the 6th Corps launched an attack against the 4th IJ Division. This attack went unsupported, as other nearby units were in disarray and they did not help. The Russians advanced into a maelstrom of fire from the Japanese, and nearly 2,000 men were lost. For those who haven't read so much about maybe World War I or World War II, the numbers that I'm saying are quite reminiscent of large battles from that time period. This was pretty horrifying warfare we're seeing. On the 15th, Oyama issued another batch of orders. I intend to reform the Japanese armies on the left bank of Shaoho, in order to prepare to advance to the line of Honho. At the time, Oyama could not ford the Shaho River, while the Russians still held positions south of it. That day, the Japanese seized Putilov Hill and Lamutun village, while Kuropakin assembled a reserve nearing 30,000 men in strength. The next day, One Tree Hill was captured as General Gerngross took command of the enormous reserve group. Gerngross was ordered to recapture Putilov and One Tree Hill. These two features were not very large, nor very steep, sitting just south of the Shaho River. At 5 p.m., the Russians unleashed their artillery upon the Japanese occupiers, who quickly withdrew. General Putilov grabbed men to attack the hill that would soon bear his name, as General Novikov with 3 regiments of the 1st European Corps attacked One Tree Hill, and the 36th East Siberian Rifle Regiment would attack the Japanese right rear. Novikov's men advanced so quickly, they caught some of the Japanese still withdrawing at One Tree Hill. This resulted in 4 Japanese companies making a nightly stand upon the hill to give their comrades time to get off. Meanwhile, Putilov heard the sounds of battle from One Tree Hill, and he ordered his men to advance with haste. His force was met by a tremendous volley of gunfire from Japanese rearguards. Yet both features fell back into Russian hands, and with it quite a boost to morale. The price was heavy. The Russians took 3,000 casualties, while the Japanese had roughly 1,000. Both sides were beginning to dig in. Neither commander had secured his objective, and thus the battle had fallen to a stalemate. Again, quite reminiscent of World War I. Winter was beginning as the men built a vast network of trenches for both sides. What has become known as the Battle of Shaoho was quite indecisive. The Russians had suffered 41,550 casualties, the Japanese 39,769. In the face of what was somewhat a reversal in the campaign, Tsar Nicholas II recalled Alexeyev to St. Petersburg, and he left Kuropakin a free hand to play his next move. Finally rid of the troublesome Alexeyev was, on one hand, a great thing for Kuropakin. It was, however, unfortunately far too late into the war. Kuropakin was not in a good position, and he could not complain of his divided command issue to the Tsar anymore, so the responsibility was his and his alone. Winter was settling in, and news of Port Arthur's fall and news of revolutionary fever back home was rampant amongst his troops. The Russians held a 100-mile-long defense. The Japanese could not outflank. But Kuropakin knew Nogi's 3rd IJA were en route. Trains were carrying men and supplies from Port Arthur. Kuropakin looked to his cavalry to better the situation. In order to induce the enemy to detach as many men as possible for their line of communications, and so to weaken their front, to handicap their supply arrangements, and to stop the rail transport of Nogi's units to the front, a raid by a mounted force was organized against their line of communications. General Mishinka was put in charge of a 6,000-strong cavalry unit alongside 6 batteries of light guns to perform a raid. His target was to seize New Chuang Station, where he hoped to achieve 2 objectives. Objective number 1 was to destroy the large stockpile of foodstuff there. Objective 2 was to destroy a portion of the track between Tashichao and Kaiping. On January the 12th, Mishinka's force approached the main store's depot, normally guarded by just 500 Japanese. His cavalry advanced along the railway as his dragoons began cutting the line behind them. At 4 p.m., a train approached from the rear with 16 trucks each carrying 30 Japanese. The train was coming extremely fast and steamed past them while also firing upon them. The depot was now garrisoned by 1,000 Japanese who were very well dug in, and they knew the Russian cavalry were en route. The mounted Cossacks made 3 charges against the Japanese lines, but they could do little without infantry support. The Russian artillery failed to have enough effect, and upon mounting casualties, Mishinka was forced to withdraw, leaving behind 62 dead and 6 wounded. Meanwhile, the dragoons cutting the railway line had no idea their force was even defeated, and they were quickly brushed aside. Thus, what could have been a brilliant raid, saving the Russians valuable time, just became a little disaster. On January the 18th, Gripenberg had arrived to take command of the 2nd Manchurian Army, situated on the right of the Russian defensive line. Within the center was the 3rd Manchurian Army, led by General Kalbars. To the left was the 1st Manchurian Army, led by Leinovich. Kuropakin would issue orders 3 days before Russia's 1905 Bloody Sunday at the Winter Palace. Our primary object is to drive the enemy behind the Taitsu River, and to inflict on him as much damage as possible. Kuropakin was unleashing a full-blown offensive, seeking to hammer the Japanese before Nogi could arrive to tip the scale. Though Mishinka's raid had failed horribly, it did bring Kuropakin valuable intelligence, indicating Nogi was not yet within the theater of war. The intelligence also indicated the Japanese left flank was quite vulnerable. Gripenberg seized the initiative and began massively redeploying units on January the 14th to the 16th. This, unfortunately, fully showcased his intent to the Japanese. Kuropakin would later write, "These movements, of course, at once disclosed our intentions, and information soon came in that the enemy had, in their turn, commenced moving their troops westward and fortifying opposite our new dispositions." The most southern-held position of the Russians was Changtao. Further south were the villages of Haikutai and Sandepu, roughly 2 miles apart, held and fortified by the Japanese. These villages held walls around 3 feet thick, surrounded by open plains. The walls had been fitted with gun holes for machine guns that the Japanese made sure had good interlocking arcs of fire. The Russian advance began on the 25th, and the winter weather was dreadful. Gripenberg's army of 75,000 men marched across the frozen Hun River. The 1st Siberian Corps of Stackelberg quickly seized Haikotai, but at a tremendous cost for casualties. Meanwhile, over at the left flank's position at Sandepu, the Japanese had 4 divisions and were attacked by 7 divisions of Gripenberg. There was a state of confusion between the forces of Gripenberg and Kalbar's armies from the very offset. Hampered by a lack of maps, literally working with sketches and facing blizzard conditions, Gripenberg's 14th Division shelled and occupied the neighboring hamlet of Paotaitsu by accident. A false report was soon dispatched to Kuropatkin, indicating Sandepu had fallen. When Gripenberg realized his mistake, he ordered his heavy artillery to shell the actual target. His troops were exhausted from the offensive and the weather, so Gripenberg gave them a day's rest on the 27th. But the rest area was literally beside Sandepu. And Sandepu was still held by the 5th IJA Division. Stackelberg's men in the area were absolutely smashed by the Japanese, who quickly attacked them. Stackelberg would lose roughly 6,000 men before withdrawing during the night. 6,000 28,000 men, an absolutely incredible number. On the night of the 28th, the bulk of Gripenberg's army was now separated from Kalbars, on either side of the Sandepu village. The Russians launched attacks against Sandepu, but failed to make any progress. The Japanese-held position was thwarting the two Russian armies' ability to cooperate. Soon Kuropatkin learnt what was going on, as Gripenberg requested reinforcements to continue his advance. Kuropatkin refused to reinforce Gripenberg and ordered him to pull back, greatly irritated by Gripenberg's insubordination. At the exact same time, Oyama ordered his armies to push the Russians past the Han River. Thus, when Gripenberg began to withdraw, he was met with a massive Japanese offensive. Oyama described the action as such. "We attempted several attack movements but suffered heavily from the enemy's artillery, and especially from his machine guns, but all the columns continued the attack with all of their might. Our forces charged into Heikotai, occupying the place firmly and entirely by 9:30. Kuropatkin had thus failed to achieve any of his objectives. The Sandepu debacle had cost him 20,000 casualties. The Japanese suffered 9,000. Over a third of the Russian losses were incurred by Stackelberg's 1st Siberian Corps, largely due to the commander refusing to comply with direct orders. As a result, Stackelberg was removed from command, and by January the 30th, Gripenberg was asking to be relieved of his command, stating he was gravely ill. Kuropatkin had this to write. "This action of his set a fatal example both to those under him and to the rest of the army, and was most harmful to all discipline. The opinions also that he had expressed to the effect that the campaign was virtually over and that we should retire to Mukden and Harbin had a dangerously disturbing effect on our weaker members. It was in the long run more harmful than any single defeat of a portion of our force would have been." As Gripenberg took his leave for St. Petersburg, he stopped by Harbin and gave a report to the Novoye Vremya. It was quite an embellished account of what had occurred. "Victory was in our hands, and I cannot tell you how anxiously I awaited my men and authorization to advance. On the night of the 29th, we retired, carrying away all of our wounded men, and even picking up broken bayonets. The men retired unwillingly with tears in their eyes. I decided that it was impossible for me to regain any longer at the front, and the next day I reported myself to General Kuropatkin, asking him to relieve me of my command immediately." And thus, Kuropatkin had finally rid himself of the meddlesome Alexiev, only to be served with the megalomaniac commander who refused to listen to orders such as Gripenberg. To make matters even worse, Gripenberg, a senior general, came back home and leaked such information to the official newspaper during a time in which revolution could break out at any moment. The mention of tens of thousands of Russian soldiers being killed in what was seen as a pointless war drove the public's outrage even further. The Times had this to report. "They had been told that they would beat the Japanese as soon as they had them on the plain. After Liaoyang, they were told that they would beat the Makaki as soon as the Kaolang was cut, and the little tricksters had to fight in the open. After the Shaho, they were told the Japanese could not bear the cold, and that they would never stand their ground in a winter engagement." By February of 1905, the war had become a one-year-old war, and the Russians had little to show for it. Meanwhile, back home, nearly 1,000 people were dead or wounded from the events of Bloody Sunday. Disorder and looting broke out across St. Petersburg. Strikes began to erupt outside the city in places like Batum, Tiflis, Baku, Kovno, Reval, Vilna, Riga, Warsaw, and of course Moscow. Over 400,000 Russian workers refused to work in January of 1905, as Tsar Nicholas II attempted appeasing the people's anger with a Duma. Soon, that began to fail. The Tsar resorted to brute force to quell the strike movement. In the next few months, an estimated 15,000 people were shot or hanged, 20,000 were beaten up, and another 45,000 would be sent into exile. The unattractive war was adding fuel to the fires of revolution within the Russian Empire. A weak aristocracy was barely holding on to its fledgling empire. The Tsar had initially saw the outbreak of war in the East as a positive thing, that would contribute to a raise of morale amongst the populace of Russia, but it was backfiring tremendously. Of course, the revolutionary fervor had more to do with other variables than an unpopular war. But what would happen if Russia lost the unpopular war? I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Please check out my new episode on the story of Yang Kyung-jung, a Korean man who supposedly fought for the Japanese Empire, the Red Army, and the Wehrmacht during World War II. But is his story true? Also, if you can, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War channel for more exclusive podcasts. General Gripenberg did not turn out to be a great replacement for Alexiev. Kuropatkin struggled to toss any offensive he could to break Oyama's armies before General Nogi's 3rd IGA arrived at the theater of war. Now all that remained was Mukden, and with it, Russia's hope of holding on to Manchuria.